Hi, everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the article Unskilled and Unaware of It by Justin Kruger and David Dunning, which was published in Psychology, the journal Psychology, in 2009. So the subtitle is How Difficulties in Recognizing One's Own Incompetence Lead to Inflated Self-Assessments. So this is an article that has a lot of interesting things to say and has gained quite a bit of cultural currency in the years since its publication. And so the primary thing that it has to say is that when you lack skills in a given area, the same lack of skill makes it difficult or even impossible to properly assess one's own performance relative to others. So that's quite a statement. The idea that really plays an important role here is the idea of metacognition, which in the paper is defined as the ability to know how well one is performing, when one is likely to be accurate in judgment, and when one is likely to be in error. So that's a pretty important skill. It's a kind of self-assessment tool, as the title implies. And so the idea is that in areas where you have some competence, you might be able to do a good job of assessing your performance in a particular task. But when you are particularly bad at something, the lack of skills that make you bad at it, not having those skills also makes it hard to realize that you're bad at it because you can't self-assess. You can't look at the work that you've done or the work of others and know whether it's good or bad. So you have no real basis for comparison. So it's logical, but we'd like to have something more than just the idea that it seems to make sense if we're going to go with this as a way of understanding the way that people behave. So, as we said, the hypothesis is that the lack of competence or skill in an area also leads to deficient metacognitive ability in that area. In other words, when you're bad at something, you don't realize how bad you are. But we can be more specific. There are 4 specific predictions that the authors of this paper make, and that they then proceed to test with a series of different studies, getting to more and more aspects of this particular phenomenon that we observe. So the first prediction is that incompetent individuals will dramatically overestimate their performance relative to objective measures. So they're going to rate their performance on tests as higher than they actually are. Secondly, incompetent individuals will lack metacognitive skills and will therefore be less able to recognize competence in others. So not only do they not know how well they did on the exam, but they have a hard time knowing how well other people did on the exam, and therefore ranking themselves amongst those people for whether they did well or poorly compared to their peers. The third prediction is that incompetent individuals will be less able to gain insight from social comparison information. So they won't be able to look around and see how other people are doing and use that information to improve their idea of how they themselves are doing. And then fourthly, that incompetent individuals can gain insight, but only by becoming more competent. So that's a little bit of an irony in the end. In order to realize that you are bad at something, you have to realize that you have to get better at it, and then you will realize how bad you were, but you won't be able to realize in the moment how bad you are doing. So kind of negatively stated some of these things, thinking about people being incompetent, but I think it's a good idea to have a broad mind about these things. Everybody has competencies and incompetencies. Each one of us has something that we're good at, things that we're good at, and things that we're poor at. And it would be nice to be able to tell the difference between the two. But as we'll see, maybe that's sometimes not quite the case. So at the end, we're going to try to see what we can take away from this, what kind of positive messages we can take, kind of action items that we can take into our lives, instead of just kind of despairing that, everything's awful and we're not going to be able to tell what's going on, right? So we're going to do a little bit better than that. Okay, so let's look at the studies. The first study is, I'm ironically laughing here, I guess. The first study is about humor, and the way that they set this up is pretty funny, actually. Basically, they had a collection of jokes, and they asked the participants in the study to rate these jokes based on how funny they were. And then as a standard, they had a panel of experts in humor, which is to say stand-up comedians, rate the same jokes, and how well you did on this test, depending on how well your assessment of the funniness of given jokes compared with the assessments of the comedians. So how well did you do compared with these other people? So, and then after the test, and this is the key thing that we're going to keep seeing over and over again, is that after the test, the subjects are asked to rank themselves amongst their peers in terms of their ability to recognize humor. So they're asked to say, how do you think you did compared with how well other people did on this task? Right? So how good do you think your ability to decide what's funny and what isn't funny compares with other people who are doing the same task? And so on average, and this is a pretty common finding, right? On average, people rank themselves in the 66th percentile. So the true average would be the 50th percentile. But in this group, when, people gave themselves a little bit of slack, they said that, when you took the averages of all the ratings that people gave themselves, overall it was 66th percentile. So everybody thinks they're above average is basically the message there. But this result was particularly stark for the bottom quartile. And that's a group we're going to be concentrating on a lot. That's what the authors refer to as the incompetent. So if you're in the bottom quartile, so your percentile score was somewhere between 0 and 25%. So on average, it should be 12.5 percentile. But those folks ranked themselves in the 58th percentile. So although they were by far the worst at this task, they still rated themselves as being above average, right? So that's what this graph is showing. It only has 4 data points. It has the bottom quartile, second, third, and fourth, their top quartile. So the bottom quartile means the bottom 25% of performers, and the top quartile means the top 25% of performers. And so what we see here is this line going up with slope 1. That's the actual average of those people. That's the true result. And then the dark line that we see creeping through here, that is the result that they gave themselves. When they had to self-assess, that's what they said. So you see this huge gap here between, I can't draw, apparently that's one of my incompetencies. There's a big gap between the actual average for the bottom quartile folks and the where they ranked themselves. So there's a problem there with self-assessment. And that problem is particularly large for the bottom quartile. So this feeds into the predictions that the people writing the paper had made. But there's some possible objections to this. So first of all, you're asking people to judge themselves on something that is imperfectly defined. And of course, people are not perfectly able to make that assessment, right? There's a lot of subjectivity involved there. So there's going to be errors. And if your real score is extremely low, right, if it's supposed to average around 12.5 percentile, then if you do make an error, it's much more likely that that error will be in the upward direction rather than the downward direction, right? Imagine that you're in the bottom 10%. You have to try really hard to underestimate yourself when 10% is the true value. There's 90% above you and 10% below. If you're going to make a mistake, it's probably going to be in the upward direction. So one possible objection to seeing significance is look, this is just regression. People don't really know where they're at, so if they have a low score, they're going to make an upward mistake. The counter argument that you could make to that objection, though, would be, well, first of all, is that the magnitude of this difference is just too big to ignore, right? From 12.5 to 58 is a huge difference. That means you need to take some notice of it. And secondly, if regression to the mean was the real problem, then we would expect to see the same thing from the top quartile. If the bottom people are going to make mistakes in the upward direction, then the top people would make mistakes in the downward direction. And in fact, you do see that if we go back, right? The top quartile actually underestimates their ability. They move down toward the mean also. That's the regression part. But you'll notice that the magnitude of those differences here and here is quite different. A very large magnitude for the bottom quartile, a very small magnitude for the top quartile. So we're going to be coming back to this because this is another interesting thing, is that we see that people at the top end of the range tend to under-assess themselves, to think that they're worse than they actually are. I'm going to talk a little bit about why that might be. All right, so the regression argument is one that we need to look at, so some statistical work needs to go into that, and also some improvement of the study design, which we'll see in the second study. And then another possible objection is subjectivity. So humor is subjective, and since we don't have a firm definition of exactly what it is, we each come up with our own. And of course, when you come up with your own definition of humor, you're going to come up with a definition which matches with your sense of humor. So of course you think you're better at it than average, right? Of course you match your own sense of humor. So the counter argument to that is that, okay, that's actually a pretty good objection. Let's try something objective rather than subjective. And that gets us to the second study. So the second study is about logical reasoning. So this is following up on study one, but now in an area with an objective measure rather than subjective. We have this logical reasoning test, and there's a clear correct and several incorrect answers for each of the questions. A 20-item test with objectively correct answers. And then after they take the test, they're asked to estimate two things now. So first of all, they're asked to estimate how many questions they got correct. And secondly, they're asked to rate their performance relative to their peers. So again, we see that the overall ranking of the subjects was to put themselves in the 66th percentile, significantly above average, although the true average is 50th percentile. As far as the number of questions that they got correct, on the whole, if you take all of the subjects together, they're actually pretty good at it. The estimate was 13.3. The actual was 12.9 out of 20. So that's pretty good. They're pretty good at estimating the objective part of this. But what about the estimating where they sat within the group? So we saw already that there's overestimation going on here, that on average 66th percentile, so too high. But let's break it down by quartiles again. So we have over here, we have the same kind of graph that we had before. And again, you'll see this very large gap between the actual and the perceived ability of the bottom quartile. In fact, in this case, it's even bigger. We see that they rank the bottom quartile on the question of how many questions did they get correct, rank themselves in the 68th percentile. And in the question of how well did they do amongst their peers, so I guess for the questions it was like 62, and for the amongst their peers it was like 68. So both very significantly higher. And you'll see this reported in the paper, the p less than 0.001. So that says that difference is statistically very significant. It's far less than 0.05, which is the standard for statistical significance. Although the overall average of what people thought they got was pretty spot on, for the bottom quartile is quite bad. The number that they actually got right was 9.6 on average, and they estimated themselves to be getting 14.2 correct. So actually, they estimated their scores to be higher than the overall average. That's astounding, but that's the way it went down. And again, we see over here on the right-hand side that the top quartile underestimated their ability. They thought they did a little bit worse relative to their peers than they actually did. So they not only, and then the final thing is that when you look at this, not only did they rank themselves above average, the bottom quartile folks actually ranked themselves higher than the people in the second quartile, right, and the third quartile. So they thought they were better than most people thought that, so if you asked two people, how do you think you did? And the person who said they thought they did the best might in fact have been the person who did worst. And that's pretty disappointing for humanity, I would say. So although these subjects were in the bottom quarter, their perception of their abilities was higher than the perception of peers who were significantly better than them. And then the miscalibration effect affected both the objective measure, which is the score, and the subjective measure, the percentile, or how they compared with their peers. So interesting, it carried over to this new realm as well. We did yet another study. The third study had two phases, which has also introduced another interesting wrinkle into what's going on here. So the third study is about grammar. This is again an objective thing. And the first phase was just like studies 1 and 2, but with grammar as the content rather than humor or logical reasoning. They took a test and then had to rate how many they think they got right on the test and where they think they ranked amongst their peers. So again, we see this same pattern, right? Very high misestimation for the bottom quartile. So the incompetent think that they are still doing up in the 60th percentile, so well above average. It's pretty flat, actually, across the board. Everybody kind of thinks they're about as good as everyone else. They're all ranking themselves at approximately the same place, in spite of the actual value being this line here. But that was only the first phase. The interesting thing is that this then went on to a second phase. And in the second phase, what they did, is they brought subjects from the top quartile and the bottom quartile back and first gave them the test answers that some of their peers entered so that they had something to compare to. They could compare their answers with those of their peers. And then after they had a look at that and basically were asked to grade their peers, based on their own knowledge, they were asked to reassess themselves, right? And some interesting things happened, or really the interesting thing is that it failed to happen. So if we look over here, we have the bottom percentile folks. So before they looked at their peers test, they thought that they were in the 66.8th percentile, and afterwards they put themselves in the 63rd percentile. So that's not a significant difference, actually. Statistically, not a big difference. Similarly, with the test score themselves, they thought that they were doing in the 65th or 60th percentile before, and they moved them up to the 65th. And they actually thought that after looking at what their peers did, they actually moved their estimation of what their score was up from 12.9 to 13.7. Now, note that the actual score they got was 9.2. So they got more wrong after looking at how the other people responded on this test. They just couldn't see. And this makes a lot of sense, right? They don't know which answers are correct. So when they see other people, not doing so well, they don't know whether they're actually doing well or not. And just seeing those tests maybe gave them a little more confidence in themselves, which is a little bit crazy. So, wow, there it is. Now, what about the people in the top percentile group, top quartile? Well, they looked at these tests, and after looking at how their peers did, they actually moved themselves up from 71 to 77 and from 69 to 79. Now, we see that the little stars here indicate that these are statistically significant results with varying degrees of significance. So when the people who actually knew what the correct answers were, they didn't change their assessment of what they thought their scores were. They actually might have moved those down a little bit from 16.9 to 16.6. And look, that's putting them even closer to their true average, which is 16.4. But they increased their assessment of themselves relative to their peers, which makes sense. They would have seen tests by their peers that got quite a few of these questions wrong. And these are the competent people. They know that the other people got them wrong because they know what the right answers are. They understand this stuff. And so seeing that other people were getting incorrect answers at a higher rate than they themselves did would make them bump themselves up relative to their peers. They would think, oh, I thought that everybody was doing this well, but actually I'm doing this better than other people are. And they actually got to more correct assessment. They still didn't get all the way up to their true talent level, which was the 88.7 percentile, but they moved up significantly and got a little bit closer to the true value. So the incompetent in the bottom quartile were unable to gain any insight from looking at their peers' work, so by social comparison, whereas the top quartile were able to gain insight from doing that. So it's something about, there's a significant difference between those two groups, and that points to this metacognition as a valid explanation. And then finally, there's a fourth study where they asked, well, can we do anything to improve the self-assessment ability of these people who are incompetent? And it turned out that one thing worked, and that thing was training them, making them better at the thing. So in this case, they took the logical reasoning test, and they gave the subject some training and improved their ability to do this, and then asked them to rate how they had done before and what they thought their ability level was in this thing. Right, so we have two groups here to compare, those who are untrained and those who are trained, and then we have the conditions before and after, right? Before and after, before and after. And so on all of these measures, we'll see a few things. So first of all, you'll notice that the numbers with the untrained group, the numbers don't change much. Right? 55 to 55, 58 to 56, 67 to 68, 78 to 81. Because nothing's changing here, so they don't change their self-assessment. There's no new information. That goes for all of the different quartiles, right? No training, no change. Now let's look at what happens with the training for the different quartiles. So we see that the people in the bottom quartile who before the training are rating themselves as 54th percentile move themselves down to 44th percentile, right? And then in the their rating of the test scores, they move themselves from 50th to 31st percentile. So they're getting much closer to the true value, which is 14 and a half, right? And then their raw test scores, they thought they had 5.3, and afterwards they moved that down to 1. Now they overshot the mark a little bit here. They actually had 3.3, right, on average. But it's all moving in the right direction. They're getting more correct by being trained. And this happens, moving toward the true value happens in all of the groups. The third quartile was already doing pretty good. They stayed about right. They got a little more correct here, and they got closer to their true values. And the same thing happens in these groups. And the top quartile is also moving in the right direction on all of these things, getting closer. They went from estimating themselves at 8.5 to 9.9, true average 10. Right? These are all getting better. Everybody gets better with training. Their metacognitive skills all improve as their underlying skills improve. So ironically, training helps you to see your incompetence, but you only kind of see it in passing. You only realize that you were incompetent as you become more competent or less incompetent. So you kind of can't see it while it's happening, but you can see it as you are improving out of that state. Okay, so what are the takeaways? Well, the big message is that when you lack skill in something, it can be hard to recognize that fact. This isn't a personality flaw. This is built into everyone. Because the same skills that are used to do the thing are also used to assess the performance at that thing. I said at that time, that's incorrect. So at that thing. No, so this doesn't apply to physical activities, right? So like when you have an objective measure that is easy to check, that doesn't require your own mental processing to check, then you can realize whether you're good or bad at something, right? When it comes to slam dunking a basketball, you just know you can't do it, or you can. And it's not like being worse at shooting basketballs makes you less aware that your balls aren't going in, right? Like you just know. You know, like, I'm terrible at this, and it's fine. You have, right? So for physical things, it's one thing, but for purely mental activities, things that are internal, you can't assess properly because you just don't have the skills, right? It happens, and everybody has different things. Everybody has some things they're good at, some things they're not. But the kind of one of the takeaways from this is that it's hard to tell which things are which, because often when you're quite bad at something that is mental, you think you're pretty good. And when you're pretty good, you also think you're pretty good. And when you're great at it, you think you're pretty good. You still move yourself down a little bit. So it's hard to tell the difference between what are your real core areas of competence and what are the areas where you need improvement. As a side note, in following on from that, the top quartile, you're going to be in the top quartile for some skills. And people who are in the top quartile tend to underestimate their abilities in those things. This may be because when they're good at a thing, so they assume that everybody else is also good at that thing. But when they get a look at other people's performances, they can correct the misperception. That's the advantage of having the skills. So here's the real big takeaway, for me at least, and you might have your own messages that you draw from this. If you want to get better at things, you can't rely only on your own perceptions. You have to have other people around who can help you see the deficiencies that you can't see. Because this study shows that the metacognitive abilities just won't be there, no matter how much you want them to be. If you don't have the underlying skills, you don't have the information to build a proper metacognition, a proper self-assessment. So it's a great idea to have people around who you can rely on to tell you some hard truths. You're pretty bad at that. You should work on it. And furthermore, those people should have skills that are different than yours. Because if you're both bad at something, then none of you is going to be able to recognize it. So it's great to have a circle of friends that you can rely on And you should also cultivate a diverse group of friends so that you're interacting with them and you can learn from each other, or you can point out for each other where things aren't going quite as well as you might think they are. And that can be very helpful. So the diversity is important. The having people outside of yourself is very important. So I think that's something positive. It tells us something about the necessity that we have as human beings for community, in order to be better as individuals. Right? I think that's something to think about. So anyway, that's Dunning and Kruger.